In this lesson, we'll be discussing shadows. If you'd like to follow along, go under the File menu to Open, and in the Sample Files folder, scroll down to 1403, adding transparent shadows, and just click Open. First, we're going to take a look at drop shadows. So why don't we select that frame that says Shadow with our selection tool, and then open the Effects panel. To apply a shadow, all I have to do is go under the FX pop-up to Drop Shadow. But I want you to take note of something. It is actually applying the shadow to the entire object. That's not what I want. Let me hit Cancel. Instead, I'm going to click on the text listing for this particular object. You can see every object, you can select the entire object and apply an effect, or just the stroke, or just the fill, or just the text. We're going to apply a drop shadow to just the text itself. So I'm clicking on the text listing, going to the FX pop-up, and going to Drop Shadow. Let me move my dialog window further down, and why don't we go through the various options. First is the blending section. It's using a blending mode of multiply. Multiply is the default blending mode, and the reason is it works really well. What it's doing is applying a translucent black shadow and using multiply to make the red background much darker. Now, it's possible that this shadow is too opaque using the defaults, so maybe we want to make it less opaque by lowering the percentage. So now you can see the shadow isn't quite as dark. The next section is position. This particular section has two different ways of doing exactly the same thing. You can offset your shadow from the object using XY coordinates. If I increase the X offset, it's moving the shadow further and further to the right. If I decrease the X offset, it's moving the shadow back towards the left. If I increase the Y offset, it's moving the shadow further down the page away from the text. If I decrease the Y offset, it's moving the shadow further up the page, closer to the object. I'm going to increase both the X and the Y offset. One more click. The other part of the position section is a different way of offsetting the shadow, distance and angle. This is the same way that drop shadows are positioned in Photoshop, using distance and an angle away from the original type. I'm going to click my up arrow, and you can see that the shadow is moving away and down from the object at 135 degrees. If I click the down arrow, it's moving the shadow closer to the object because the distance is less. Watch what happens if I change the angle by going to the angle proxy and just clicking and dragging on the line. It's moving the shadow around the object. Use global light. If I check that, any object that has use global light checked will be exactly at the same angle as every other object using global light for their effects. I'm going to uncheck use global light. The next section down are the various options for the shadow itself. Its size, which in other effects you'll know as width. It's how blurry the shadow is, how soft the shadow is. If you increase the size, the shadow gets more and more diffused until it practically goes away. Let me click the down arrow to make it a little bit sharper, a little bit harder of a shadow. The next area is called spread. This is very similar, only just the opposite, of choke in other effects. It's skewing the effect further outward. So if I increase the spread, it's moving the darkest part of the shadow, the most opaque part of the shadow further out. Let me click and drag the scrubby slider back to 0. I can also add noise, which is texture or grain. I'm going to go to about 5%. So you can see how a lot of the names of the various settings are very similar in different effects. I'm going to click OK. Now, I just wanted to point out, with this object still selected, if I look in my control panel, there is a drop shadow button for turning on or turning off by clicking the shadow. And it's going to pick up the last settings that were applied to this particular object. Why is this the only effect that actually has its own button in the control panel? Well, drop shadows are probably the most popular effect in the entire universe. One of my friends jokes, it's not a design unless it has a drop shadow. Drop shadows tend to be overused. While it's a beautiful effect, like anything else in great design, I don't use it just to use it. I use it because it actually adds to the design concept. Just something to keep in mind. I'm going to click on my next object down, which says Inner Shadow, and let me scroll down just a little bit here to make room for the dialog window. In this case, I want to select Object to apply an inner shadow effect to the entire object. I'm going to go under my FX pop-up menu to Inner Shadow, and you're going to see that the dialog box is extremely similar to Drop Shadow. As a matter of fact, it is exactly the same except for the terminology choke instead of spread, because choke will skew the effect further into the object, and spread will skew an effect further out in an object. Why don't we go through the settings very quickly? You can see the blending mode is still multiply, and it's using black as the shadow. The opacity is 75%, which is kind of dark. Why don't we go to about 60? What is the best opacity? It really depends. It's whatever looks best to you for this particular situation. So you do have to play. Now, there is a position section. I'm going to use distance and angle in this case. I'm going to make the distance and angle 135 degrees. And the distance, I'm going to increase it quite a bit so that it is not only going over the top of the white stroke in this object, it's actually going into the fill as well. Now, let me increase the size, which is going to make this inner shadow more and more diffused. It's making it softer. And let me add just a little bit of noise to make it look less computer generated. And maybe I'll choke it in just a little bit. Let's see how that looks. Well, you got to try it. I really don't like what choke is doing here, so I'm going to go back down to 0. You have to play in order to see if it's really working the way you want. The only thing I think I want to change is opacity. I'm going to go even lighter to, how about 50% opaque? And that's looking pretty good. Why don't we click OK? Now, I'm going to click my W key just to go into preview. And you can see how that inner shadow is creating almost a beveled matte kind of look. Really kind of cool. I want to also apply an inner shadow to the text. So let me click on the text listing, go under my FX pop-up and choose Inner Shadow. You can see that almost looks like cutout lettering, almost as if the red fill had the lettering cut out of it and you're seeing a white piece of paper beneath. Really kind of cool. Looks a little bit dark. Why don't we just lighten it up a little bit, maybe like 55% opaque? Why don't we diffuse it just a little bit more by increasing the size? Okay, really like it. We're going to continue discussing effects and transparency in the next lesson.